The emergency session of the Galactic Council had been called at the crack of dawn, Nexus Standard Time. Representatives from 47 species filled the great chamber, their various forms of anxiety manifesting in everything from nervous shivering to the release of pheromones that made the air recycling work overtime. Ambassador Veltar of the Zephyrian Republic stood at the central
Honored
podium,
colleagues,
his crystalline form flickering
what
with
we
distress
face
patterns that
is
needed no translation.
Kepler colonies have fallen.
The holographic
Arcturus
display
station went
behind
silent
him
yesterday. The
showed
Deviewers
star
are not
charts
simply
that made
conquering
every
territory.
being in the chamber shift uncomfortably. Red zones spread like infection across 3 entire systems, marking territory now controlled by the Devourers. Honored colleagues, Beltar began, his harmonic voice carrying the weight of desperation. What we face is no longer a localized threat. The Kepler colonies have fallen. Arcturus station went silent yesterday. The Devourers are not simply conquering territory, they are consuming entire populations. A ripple of fear moved through the assembly. The Devourers were every species' nightmare made real. They appeared from the void between galaxies, their bioships growing larger with each victory, their hunger apparently infinite. Wherever they passed, worlds became barren rock, stripped of every organic molecule. Councillor Thex of the Mantari Hive Collective raised a segmented appendage. The combined fleets of Zephyr, Mantari, and Corvan forces total 800 vessels. We have held them at the Nebula Line for 6 months, but our losses... She trailed off, mandibles clicking in distress. We cannot hold much longer. The truth hung in the air like a toxin. The 3 most militarily advanced species in the galaxy, working together, were losing. The Devourers seemed to adapt to every weapon, every tactic. Each engagement cost them ships they couldn't replace, while the enemy only grew stronger. We need reinforcements, Velta continued. Medical supplies for the refugees, evacuation vessels for the civilian population still trapped in the combat zones. The Outer Rim colonies alone housed 12 billion souls. Murmurs of sympathy filled the chamber, but they were hollow sounds. Everyone knew the harsh mathematics of the situation. The major powers were already committed. The smaller species lacked the resources to make a meaningful difference. They were asking for a miracle from a galaxy that had run out of miracles. That's when the human representative spoke up. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had been sitting quietly in the human delegation's modest section, a small alcove that reflected Earth's recent admission to galactic society. Humans had been part of the Council for barely a century, and their contribution to galactic affairs had been minimal. They ran some trade routes, operated a few research stations, maintained embassies on the major worlds. Nothing more. If I may, Vasquez said, standing smoothly. She was tall for her species, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Earth would be willing to provide assistance. A few beings turned to look at her with what might charitably be called polite attention. Others didn't bother. The human delegation consisted of exactly 3 individuals representing a single star system on the galactic periphery. What could they possibly offer? Delta's form brightened with diplomatic courtesy. Ambassador Vasquez, we are grateful for any aid Earth can provide. Medical supplies, perhaps? Refugee transport vessels? Something like that. Vasquez replied with a slight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'll need to consult with our Admiralty, of course. We'll have an answer within 48 standard hours. The session moved on to other matters. Logistics, evacuation routes, the grim calculus of which populations could be saved and which would have to be abandoned. The human offer was noted in the official record and promptly forgotten by almost everyone present. Almost everyone. Councillor Drex of the Corvan Empire had been watching the human representative carefully throughout the session. The Corvans were warriors by nature and culture, their society built around military honor and tactical excellence. They understood the subtle art of warfare in all its forms, including the information that lived in silences and spaces between words. As the session adjourned, Drex approached the human delegation. His scaled hide bore the ritual scars of a dozen campaigns, and his eyes held the flat calculation of a predator evaluating potential prey. Ambassador Vasquez, he said in his gravelly voice. A word, if you would. Vasquez dismissed her aide with a gesture and faced the Corvan directly. Councillor Drex. How can I help you? Your offer of assistance, Drex said carefully. It seemed confident.
Perhaps more confident than one might expect from a species with limited military resources.
Vasquez tilted her head slightly. Did it? I wasn't aware I had projected any particular level of confidence. No, Drex agreed, you did not. That is what intrigues me. In my experience, beings who are truly helpless make grand gestures of despair. Beings who possess hidden strengths keep their words simple and their promises modest. A moment of silence stretched between them. Around the great chamber, delegates were filing out in clusters, their conversations a susurrus of worried voices in dozens of languages. Counselor, Vasquez said finally, what do you know about human military doctrine? Drex's eyes narrowed. Very little. You have been remarkably opaque about your defensive capabilities. The galactic consensus is that Earth maintains perhaps 50 patrol vessels and a token defense force. The galactic consensus, Vasquez replied, tends towards lazy assumptions. She paused, studying his scarred features. Tell me, when the Corvins go to war, do you announce your fleet strength to your enemies beforehand? Understanding dawned in Drex's eyes like sunrise over a battlefield. You're not a minor power playing at diplomacy. We're whatever we need to be, Vasquez said. In 48 hours, you'll see what we need to be now. She turned to leave, then paused. Counselor Drex, when the human fleet arrives, I recommend you and your people keep careful records. Military historians of the future will want to study what happens next. Drex watched her go, his warrior's instincts screaming warnings and possibilities in equal measure. He had seen confidence before, had worn it himself into countless battles. But this was different. This was the quiet certainty of someone who had never lost a war. His aide approached with a data tablet. Sir? The latest reports from the Nebula line. The Devourers have broken through Sector 7. Admiral Keth estimates we have perhaps 2 weeks before they reach the inner colonies. Drax took the tablet but didn't look at it. His gaze remained fixed on the doorway where the human ambassador had disappeared. Contact our intelligence division, he said quietly. I want everything they have on human military capabilities. Everything. And I want it now. Sir, our files on human military strength are quite thin. They've never participated in a major conflict, never demonstrated significant... That's the point, Drex interrupted. A species doesn't survive in this galaxy by being weak and obvious about it. If the humans have been hiding their true capabilities, we need to know what we're about to witness. As the last delegates departed the council chamber, emergency klaxons began wailing across the station. Another colony had gone silent. Another billion souls had vanished into the hungry void. But somewhere in the darkness between stars, the third fleet was already moving, their acceleration curves calculated to arrive exactly when promised. And aboard the flagship Indomitable, Admiral Sarah Chen stood before a tactical display that showed not the galaxy's current desperate situation, but something else entirely. It showed the galaxy as it would look in 72 hours, when the Devourer threat would no longer exist. The display was marked not with red zones of enemy control, but with the green indicators of complete human victory. Because when humans went to war, they didn't go to fight. They went to win. And they had never in their entire history failed to keep that promise. 47 hours after Ambassador Vasquez had made her modest offer of assistance, every long-range sensor array in the Kepler system began screaming alerts that their operators initially dismissed as equipment malfunctions. The readings were impossible. The mass signatures were off the charts. The energy outputs defied everything they knew about practical starship engineering. Either every sensor in the system had simultaneously developed the same exotic fault, or something unprecedented was approaching through hyperspace. Admiral Keth of the combined Corvin, Zephyrian, Mantari defense fleet was reviewing casualty reports when his communications officer interrupted with a tremor in her voice that cut through his concentration like a blade. Sir, we're receiving a transmission. It's from the humans. Keth looked up from his holographic display, where red icons marked the positions of Devourer bioships that had consumed 2 more colonies in the past 18 hours. Patch it through. The main viewer shimmered, then resolved into the image of a human female in a crisp military uniform that bore no ornamentation except a simple nameplate reading Chen and rank insignia that meant nothing to alien eyes. Behind her, banks of displays showed tactical information that seemed to exist in impossible abundance. This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Earth Defense Force 3rd Fleet, she said in perfect galactic standard, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed instantly. We are responding to the Council's request for aid. Admiral Keth, I believe you are the operational commander for this theater? Keth's tactical displays were now showing hyperspace emergence signatures that made his stomach clench with disbelief. Admiral Chen, yes, I command the defense fleet. But your sensor readings are... There must be some error in the data transmission. No error, Chen replied. We'll be dropping out of hyperspace in approximately 90 seconds. I'm transmitting our fleet roster and tactical capabilities now. Please review and advise where you need us most. The data package that arrived on Keth's systems made him stand up so abruptly that his aide stepped back in alarm. The numbers couldn't be real. 247 ships of the line. Dreadnoughts with firepower ratings that exceeded anything in the Galactic military database. Carrier groups with fighter complements that outnumbered entire planetary defense forces. Admiral, Keth said carefully, these specifications, they indicate weapon systems that are theoretically impossible. The power requirements alone would demand reactors the size of small stations. Chen's expression didn't change. Admiral, with respect, your theoretical limitations are your own. We have our timeline to consider. Where do you need the Devourers removed from the equation? Before Keth could respond, space itself seemed to tear open. Hyperspace exit points bloomed like flowers across the tactical display, each one disgorging ships that registered on sensors as mobile fortresses. The lead vessel emerged with a grace that belied its massive size, its hull stretching for kilometers and bristling with weapon systems that made veteran warriors recalculate everything they thought they knew about space combat. The Indomitable was a study in utilitarian brutality. No decorative elements, no ceremonial features. Every surface was either armor plating, sensor arrays, or weapon mounts. It announced its purpose with the subtle elegance of a perfectly designed killing machine. Behind it came the battle line, dreadnoughts with names like Relentless, Unstoppable, and Final Answer, heavy cruisers that moved in formations that spoke of decades of tactical refinement, destroyers that accelerated with impossible grace, their weapons already tracking potential targets. And then came the carriers. Vast ships that immediately began deploying fighter screens with mechanical precision, each small craft moving with the coordinated lethality of a hunting pack. The fighters themselves were revelations, their design speaking to engineering principles that treated the laws of physics as suggestions rather than limitations. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Keth watched his senses struggling to process the sheer magnitude of what had just arrived. His communications officer was frantically trying to update their tactical computers with the new friendly signatures. His weapons officer was staring at the power readings with the expression of someone witnessing a religious miracle. "How?" Keth whispered, then caught himself and opened a channel. "Admiral Chen, your fleet is impressive. How did Earth construct such vessels without the galaxy's notice?" Chen's smile was sharp enough to cut diamond. "Admiral, the galaxy notices what we allow it to notice. For the past century, while we've been running your trade routes and attending your diplomatic functions, our shipyards have been busy. We've found that appearing harmless has significant strategic advantages." The implications crashed over Keth like a tide. A species didn't build a fleet like this in response to an emergency. This represented decades of planning, centuries of industrial development, the kind of sustained military investment that only made sense if war was not just expected, but inevitable. "You've been preparing," he said, understanding flooding through him. "This entire time, you've been preparing for something like this." "Something exactly like this," Chen corrected. "Our analysts predicted the Devourer incursion 17 years ago. We've been tracking their approach vectors, studying their tactics, designing countermeasures. Today's engagement is not an improvisation, Admiral. It's the execution of a plan we've been refining for nearly 2 decades. The tactical display updated again as human ships took positions throughout the system with the fluid precision of a choreographed dance. Formations that had looked random to alien eyes revealed themselves as interlocking fields of fire, overlapping sensor coverage, and kill zones that would funnel any enemy advance into predetermined destruction corridors. Counselor Drex's voice cut through the command channel, his warrior's excitement barely contained. "Admiral Chen, my intelligence division has been attempting to analyze your capabilities. The energy signatures we're detecting suggest weapon systems that operate on principles we don't recognize. Kinetic orbital bombardment systems," Chen replied matter-of-factly. "Relativistic particle beams, quantum cascade missiles, gravitational manipulation fields. We've found that the Devourers adapt quickly to conventional weapons, so we've developed some unconventional alternatives." The words meant nothing to the alien commanders, but their scientific advisors were frantically running calculations and arriving at conclusions that challenged everything they believed about the limits of military technology. On the edge of the system, Devourer bioships detected the new arrivals and began adjusting their approach vectors. The massive organic vessels moved with predatory grace, their living hulls already adapting to scan the newcomers for weaknesses. They had faced dozens of species, consumed hundreds of worlds, and never encountered resistance they couldn't eventually overcome. They began broadcasting the psychic screams that had broken the morale of every previous enemy, the alien wails that spoke of inevitable consumption and the futility of resistance. The human fleet's response was immediate and devastating, not in weapons fire, but in something far more unsettling. They began broadcasting back. Human voices filled the communication channels, not with screams or terror, but with something that made every alien crew member freeze in recognition. They were singing war songs, battle hymns, chants that spoke of glory and death and victory at any cost. The harmonies were complex and beautiful, and absolutely terrifying in their implications. "Admiral Chen," Keth said slowly, "your crew is singing?" "Old tradition," Chen replied, her eyes never leaving her tactical displays as they updated with targeting solutions. "We've found that psychological warfare works both ways. The Devourers try to break our morale with their death screams. We respond by letting them know that death doesn't frighten us, it inspires us." The Devourer fleet hesitated for the first time in their recorded history. Their bioship's sensory organs detected something in those human voices that their racial memory couldn't categorize. Not fear or desperation, but the kind of focused anticipation that predators reserve for the moment before the kill. Chen's voice cut through the singing with mechanical precision. "All ships, this is Indomitable. Target packages are distributed. Fire control solutions are locked. Today we remove a threat to galactic civilization. Today we show the universe that some things are worth fighting for." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of every human who had ever stood against the darkness. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. You are weapons free. Send them to hell." The human fleet opened fire, and reality itself seemed to scream. The first human weapon to fire was the Indomitable's main gun, and it redefined every alien understanding of what constituted naval artillery. The massive cannon emerged from the dreadnought's armored hull, like the fang of some primordial predator, its barrel stretching nearly a kilometer in length. When it fired, space itself seemed to ripple around the projectile's path, reality bending under the sheer kinetic force being unleashed. The round struck the lead Devourer bioship at 97% the speed of light. The organic vessel, which had weathered particle beams and fusion warheads without significant damage, simply ceased to exist. One moment it was a writhing mass of living tissue the size of a small moon, and the next it was an expanding cloud of superheated plasma that painted the void in brilliant colors that hurt to look at directly. Admiral Keth watched his senses struggling to process what they had just recorded. The energy release from that single shot exceeded the total output of his entire fleet's weapon systems combined. "Impossible," whispered his Scion officer, a Zephyrian whose crystalline form was flickering with patterns of pure shock. "The power requirements for such a weapon would demand the entire output of a star." On the Indomitable's bridge, Admiral Chen was already moving to the next target. "That's why we build our reactors bigger than you think we need," she said into the communication channel. Though whether she was responding to the alien's comment or simply providing education was unclear. The Devourer fleet reacted to the destruction of their lead ship with the swift reorganization that had made them so terrifying to previous opponents. Bioships began splitting into smaller configurations, their living hulls flowing like liquid as they dispersed their mass to present more difficult targets. The human response was immediate and comprehensive. The battle line opened fire with weapons that operated on principles the galaxy's best scientists had dismissed as theoretical impossibilities. Relativistic particle beams lanced out from the heavy cruisers, each shot accelerating streams of matter to speeds that turned physics into a weapon. Where they struck, Devourer bioships didn't just die, they were reduced to their component atoms, their organic complexity unraveled at the subatomic level. The destroyers launched volleys of what human tactical displays labeled as quantum cascade missiles, weapons that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, before phase shifting into reality just as they reached their targets. The explosions that followed weren't merely destructive, they were existential negations, zones where matter briefly forgot how to exist. But it was the carriers that truly demonstrated the gulf between human military doctrine and anything the galaxy had previously witnessed. The fighter craft they launched moved with acceleration curves that should have turned their pilots into paste against the bulkheads, yet they maneuvered with impossible precision through three-dimensional space. Each human fighter was a testament to engineering that treated the universe's limitations as challenges to be overcome, rather than boundaries to be accepted. Their weapons fire wasn't the crude energy beams or kinetic projectiles that alien civilizations had perfected, but something far more sophisticated. The fighters were using gravitational manipulation fields, essentially creating pocket black holes that lasted just long enough to strip entire sections of hull from the Devourer bioships before evaporating harmlessly into space. It was weaponized physics at its most elegant and terrifying. "How are they doing that?" demanded Councillor Drex, his veteran warrior's mind struggling to process tactical innovations that made his own species' military doctrine seem quaint by comparison. "Humans don't accept that something can't be done," Chen replied conversationally, as if she weren't directing a fleet action that was rewriting the laws of space combat in real time. "We just find new ways to do it. Your species developed excellent tactics within the limitations of conventional physics. We developed new physics." The Devourer fleet, for the first time in their recorded history, began to retreat. The bioships that had consumed entire star systems were pulling back from an enemy they couldn't adapt to quickly enough to survive. Their organic hulls, which had evolved to counter every previous form of attack, were proving inadequate against weapons that operated on principles their racial memory had never encountered. But the humans weren't finished demonstrating their capabilities. "All ships," Chen's voice cut through the tactical chatter with surgical precision, "initiate gravity well deployment. Let's show our new friends what happens when we get serious." On the tactical display, new icons appeared around the human capital ships. The massive dreadnoughts were generating something that made Admiral Keth's science officer emit a harmonic shriek of pure terror. "They're creating artificial gravity wells," the Zephyrian announced, his crystalline form now flickering so rapidly it resembled a strobe light. "They're weaponizing gravitational fields on a stellar scale." The effect was immediately apparent on long-range sensors. Space itself was warping around the human fleet, creating gravitational gradients that trapped the retreating Devourer bioships like insects in amber. The organic vessels that had seemed so formidable moments before were now struggling against forces that could bend starlight, and then the human fleet demonstrated why they had been so confident in their timeline estimates. The dreadnoughts began firing again, but this time their weapons weren't targeting the bioships directly. Instead, they were firing into the artificial gravity wells they had created, using the warped space-time as a focusing lens that amplified their kinetic rounds to energies that registered on sensors as localized stellar events. Each shot became a miniature supernova, contained and directed by gravitational fields that human science had learned to manipulate with the casual precision that other species reserved for adjusting room temperature. The Devourer fleet simply vanished. Not destroyed, not defeated, obliterated so completely that their constituent matter was converted to pure energy and dissipated across several light-years of space. Where moments before there had been dozens of bioships capable of consuming worlds, there was now only the fading glow of particles returning to their component quantum states. The silence that followed was broken by Admiral Keth's tactical officer, whose voice carried the stunned reverence of someone who had witnessed the impossible. "Sir, the entire Devourer fleet has been eliminated. Complete destruction. No survivors, no debris fields, they're simply gone." Chen's voice returned to the communication channel, her tone carrying the casual satisfaction of someone who had completed a routine task. "Admiral Keith, the immediate threat to this system has been neutralized. However, our analysis indicates that this was merely a scouting force. The main Devourer fleet is approximately 72 hours behind this advance group." The alien commanders exchanged glances that spoke volumes. If that demonstration of overwhelming firepower had been used against a mere scouting force, what exactly were the humans planning to do when the real enemy arrived? "Admiral Chen," Councillor Drex said carefully, "you mentioned that you've been preparing for this specific threat for 17 years. Might I inquire about the scope of those preparations?" Chen's smile was visible even over the long-range communication link. "Councillor, what you've witnessed today was conducted by a single human fleet. We have 17 more just like it, positioned at strategic points throughout the galaxy. The third fleet was chosen for this engagement not because we needed our best ships, but because we were the closest to your location." The implications hung in the void like a gravitational anomaly. 18 fleets, each apparently capable of reducing any known threat to constituent particles. The humans hadn't just been hiding their military capabilities, they had been concealing the existence of a naval force that could have conquered the entire galaxy without significant opposition. "But more importantly," Chen continued, "we've been analyzing Devourer tactical doctrine, biological composition, and strategic objectives for nearly 2 decades. The weapons you've seen today were specifically designed to counter their adaptive capabilities. Every system, every tactic, every strategic deployment has been refined through thousands of combat simulations. She paused, consulting a display that showed tactical information beyond alien comprehension. In approximately 70 miles 1 hour, the main Devourer fleet will arrive in this system. They will be expecting to find the scattered remains of their advanced force and a demoralized defensive fleet ready for consumption. Instead, they will find something that their racial memory has no context for processing. Which is? Keth asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Humans at war, Chen replied simply. And we've had 17 years to get very, very good at it. The communication channel closed, leaving the alien commanders to contemplate a future that had just been fundamentally redefined by a species they had dismissed as minor players in galactic civilization. In the depths of space, human shipyards that had remained hidden for decades began launching vessels that made the Third Fleet look like a diplomatic escort. The real war was about to begin, and the galaxy was about to learn what happened when humans stopped pretending to be harmless. 70 hours after the destruction of the Devourer Advance Force, the main enemy fleet emerged from hyperspace like a nightmare given form and substance. They came not as individual ships, but as a living constellation, billions of organic vessels ranging from fighter-sized parasites to hive mothers the size of terrestrial continents. The biofleet moved with the coordinated precision of a single organism, which in many ways it was. Each ship was connected to the others through quantum-entangled neural networks that allowed for instantaneous communication and tactical coordination across impossible distances. Admiral Keth had seen intelligence reports about Devourer fleets before, but witnessing one in person was an experience that challenged the sanity of any thinking being. The bioships pulsed with alien life, their hulls rippling with muscular contractions that propelled them through space. Sensory organs the size of city blocks tracked across the void, searching for prey. Weapon graphs that resembled both flowers and cancer tumors swiveled to focus on potential targets. By the eternal light, whispered his sensor operator, her voice thick with the kind of primal fear that evolution had hardwired into every species that had ever faced a predator. There are millions of them. The tactical display couldn't even properly render the scope of what was approaching. The computer systems gave up trying to assign individual target designations and simply painted the entire approaching mass as a single, undifferentiated threat. It was like trying to count raindrops in a hurricane. But Admiral Chen's voice cut through the existential dread with the calm precision of someone reading routine technical specifications. Indomitable to all allied vessels. Confirm your positions outside the designated engagement zone. Today's demonstration will require a significant volume of space. Keth's fleet began withdrawing to the coordinates that human tactical officers had marked as safe observation positions. The zones they were abandoning represented cubic light hours of space, volumes that could have contained entire star systems. The scale of the coming battle was beyond anything in recorded galactic history. Admiral Chen, Keth transmitted. Your fleet is heavily outnumbered. Even with your technological advantages, the mathematical reality... Admiral, Shen interrupted gently, you're thinking in terms of conventional warfare. Ship versus ship, weapon against weapon, tactics against tactics. That's not what this is. On the long-range displays, new contacts were emerging from hyperspace. Human reinforcements arriving with clockwork precision, their timing calculated to the second. But these weren't additional fleets in the conventional sense. What emerged defied every principle of naval architecture that galactic civilization had developed over millions of years. The first new arrival registered on sensors as a single vessel nearly 1,000 kilometers in length. Its hull was a study in geometric impossibility, surfaces that seemed to fold in on themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. The ship's designation appeared on the tactical display as HSS Axiom Breaker, and just reading the name somehow filled observers with a sense of impending cosmic significance. "What is that thing?" Drex demanded, his warrior's instincts screaming warnings that his rational mind couldn't process. "That," Chen replied with evident satisfaction, "is what happens when human engineers decide that the laws of physics are more like guidelines. The axiom breaker operates on principles that your science would classify as impossible. We prefer to think of it as highly improbable." The massive vessel began to unfold, its hull plates separating to reveal an interior that seemed larger than the ship's external dimensions. Weapon systems emerged that looked less like technology and more like crystallized mathematics, their forms suggesting equations given physical reality. But it wasn't alone. More impossible ships were emerging from hyperspace, each one a testament to human refusal to accept limitations. The reality engine appeared to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. The entropy reversal was somehow moving backward through time while advancing through space. The final theorem was broadcasting equations that made alien mathematicians weep with incomprehension. "How many ships do you have?" Keth asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of them," Chen replied simply. "Every ship we've ever built, every weapon we've ever designed, every strategic innovation we've developed over the past century. The Devourers represent an existential threat to all life in the galaxy. We're responding with existential solutions." The Devourer fleet had detected the human reinforcements and was adapting with the fluid grace that had made them so terrifying to previous opponents. The bioships began merging, their organic hulls flowing together like living liquid to create larger, more powerful configurations. Hive minds that had existed as separate entities for millennia joined into a superconsciousness that approached the complexity of a small god. The response was immediate and coordinated. The Devourer fleet began broadcasting psychic attacks that had driven entire civilizations to madness. Reality-warping influences that convinced entire populations that resistance was futile and consumption was inevitable. The human fleet's response was to begin playing music. Not the war songs from the previous engagement, but something far more sophisticated. Symphonies that seemed to incorporate impossible harmonics. Melodies that existed in mathematical spaces that shouldn't have supported conscious thought. The music wasn't just beautiful. It was weaponized aesthetic theory, compositions that treated the Devourer psychic attacks like discordant notes in an orchestra and corrected them into harmony. "They're using art as a weapon," breathed Keth's cultural analyst, a being whose specialty was understanding how different species express their deepest values through creative endeavors. "They've turned music into a form of mimetic warfare." The effect on the Devourer fleet was immediate and devastating. The bioships that relied on psychic coordination began to falter as their mental links became overwhelmed with human artistic concepts that their alien psychology couldn't process. Fear and hunger, the fundamental drives that motivated their species, were being systematically replaced with appreciation for beauty and mathematical elegance. And then the human fleet opened fire with weapons that redefined the concept of warfare itself. The Axiom Breaker's main gun didn't fire projectiles or energy beams. Instead, it fired concepts, launching the idea of destructive force directly at enemy targets. Devourer bioships found themselves trying to defend against attacks that existed primarily as mathematical abstractions, weapons that killed through logical necessity rather than physical interaction. The reality engine began systematically editing local spacetime, changing the fundamental constants that governed how matter and energy interacted. Within its area of effect, the Devourer bioships discovered that their organic chemistry no longer functioned according to the rules that had allowed them to exist. They didn't die, so much as become conceptually impossible. The final theorem proved mathematically that the Devourer fleet could not win, then made that proof physically manifest. Enemy ships simply stopped existing once the universe accepted the logical conclusion of the human calculations. "This isn't a battle," Keth said, watching formations of Devourer bioships vanish as they encountered weapons that operated on principles his species had never imagined. "This is applied philosophy." "Correct," Chen replied. "We spent 17 years studying the Devourers from every possible perspective: military analysis, biological research, psychological profiling, philosophical examination of their fundamental nature. We discovered that they weren't just a military threat. They were a conceptual problem. On the tactical display, the Devourer fleet was being systematically deconstructed by weapons that attacked the very ideas that allowed them to exist. Bioships that had survived the heat death of galaxies were being defeated by humans who had learned to weaponize logic itself.
Their entire species is built around the concept of consumption, Chen continued, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose decades of preparation were finally bearing fruit.
They exist to devour, to grow, to consume everything they encounter. We realized that defeating them required more than superior firepower. It required proving that consumption was not a universal imperative. The human fleet began broadcasting again, but this time it wasn't music. It was the concept of creation, the idea of building rather than destroying, the mathematical proof that cooperation produced better outcomes than predation. The Devourers, whose entire evolutionary history was based on consumption, found themselves confronted with concepts that their racial memory had no framework for processing. The effect was psychological collapse on a species-wide scale. Bioships that had terrorized the galaxy for eons simply stopped functioning as their pilots, grappled with the revolutionary idea that there might be better ways to exist than endless hunger. Admiral Chen, Drake said slowly, you haven't just defeated the Devourers. You've convinced them that they were wrong about the fundamental nature of existence. That was the only way to ensure they would never return, Chen replied. Physical destruction could always be recovered from, given time. But philosophical defeat? That's permanent. The last of the Devourer bioships were now drifting powerless through space, their crews struggling to comprehend a universe where consumption wasn't the highest virtue. Some were actually beginning to attempt communication, reaching out with the first non-hostile transmissions their species had ever sent. They're surrendering? Keth said in amazement. A species that has never shown mercy is asking for it. They're evolving, Chen corrected. We've given them new concepts to work with. It will take time, but they'll find new ways to exist that don't require consuming everything they encounter. As the human fleet began power-down sequences for weapons that had just rewritten the rules of cosmic engagement, Admiral Keth found himself contemplating a universe that had just become a fundamentally different place. The galaxy's most terrifying threat had been defeated not through superior violence, but through superior ideas. And the species responsible for this victory had been quietly running trade routes and attending diplomatic functions for a century. Admiral Chen, he said finally, what exactly are humans? Chen's smile was visible even across the light hours of space that separated their ships. Admiral, we're whatever the universe needs us to be. Today, it needed teachers. Tomorrow, who knows? The communication channel closed, leaving the assembled alien fleets to watch, as human ships began the delicate process of helping their former enemies discover what it meant to create rather than consume. In the depths of space, something unprecedented was happening. A species that had known only hunger for millions of years was learning to appreciate beauty, and the galaxy would never be the same. 6 months after the engagement that Galactic historians would later call the Paradigm War, the council chambers on Nexus Station had been expanded to accommodate new perspectives and new participants. The most significant addition was a delegation of beings that had once been the galaxy's greatest nightmare. The former Devourer representatives sat in specially constructed biochambers that maintained the atmospheric conditions their transformed physiology required. Their appearance had changed dramatically from the nightmarish predatory forms that had once terrorized star systems. The conversion process that human philosophical weapons had triggered had been more profound than anyone had initially understood. Where once there had been creatures of pure consumption, beings driven by insatiable hunger, there now sat entities that seemed to glow with an inner light. Their biological forms had adapted to process energy directly from stellar radiation, eliminating the need for organic consumption. More remarkably, they had developed aesthetic sensory organs that allowed them to perceive and appreciate beauty in ways that made even the most artistically advanced species seem crude by comparison. Ambassador Vasquez, now bearing the additional title of Philosophical Warfare Division Director, was presenting the Council with humanity's proposal for galactic restructuring. The document she was reading from had been co-authored by human philosophers, former Devourer consciousness architects, and representatives from 47 species. The fundamental issue, she explained to the assembled delegates, was not that the Devourers were evil in any conventional sense. The problem was that their entire species had evolved under the mistaken assumption that scarcity was a universal constant. Once we demonstrated that abundance was possible through cooperation and creative synthesis, their entire worldview restructured itself. Council effects of the Mantari Hive Collective raised a segmented appendage. Ambassador? The transformation we've witnessed is unprecedented in galactic history, but many of us are still struggling to understand the implications. One of the former Devourer representatives gestured for permission to speak, its new vocal organs producing harmonies that seemed to carry meaning on multiple levels simultaneously. Honored colleagues, it said in a voice that somehow conveyed both infinite sadness for its species past and boundless hope for their future, what the humans showed us was that existence need not be a zero-sum equation. For eons we believed that for one being to gain, another must lose. We consumed because we thought the universe was finite. The being's form shimmered with patterns that human observers had learned to recognize as expressions of profound gratitude, but humans demonstrated infinite expansion through creative synthesis. They showed us how two ideas could combine to create something larger than the sum of their parts. How cooperation could generate resources that competition could never achieve. How beauty itself could be a form of energy more powerful than any physical force. Admiral Chen, now bearing the title Fleet Admiral of Galactic Defense Coordination, stood to address the assembly. Behind her, holographic displays showed star charts that had been fundamentally redrawn, Systems that had been marked as consumed or destroyed were now showing signs of regeneration, as former devourers worked to restore worlds they had once stripped bare. The military implications of what we've accomplished extend far beyond the defeat of a single threat, Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven that the impossible was merely another engineering challenge. What we've demonstrated is that warfare itself can be evolved beyond the crude exchange of destructive forces. She gestured to the displays, which began showing tactical analyses that redefined the concept of victory. Traditional military doctrine focuses on the destruction of enemy capability and will to fight. But what if instead of destroying the enemy, we could transform them into allies? What if the most effective weapon wasn't something that killed, but something that enlightened? Councillor Drax leaned forward, his scarred features reflecting deep contemplation. Admiral, the weapons your species deployed against the Devourers, they operated on principles that our military academies don't have frameworks for analyzing. How do we prepare our forces for conflicts where the battlefield exists in conceptual space rather than physical reality? You learn new ways of thinking about conflict itself, Chen replied. For the past 6 months, we've been working with volunteers from every species in the Council to develop what we're calling constructive warfare doctrine. Instead of training soldiers to destroy enemies, we're training them to identify and resolve the philosophical conflicts that make enemies necessary in the first place. The implications were staggering. Warfare that sought to understand rather than destroy. Military forces trained in philosophy and psychology rather than weapons and tactics. Strategic objectives that focused on converting opposition rather than eliminating it. Ambassador Vasquez activated another holographic display that showed development projects across the galaxy. The former Devourers have proven remarkably effective as partners in galactic reconstruction. Their biological engineering capabilities, now directed toward creation rather than consumption, are helping us restore ecosystems, terraform barren worlds, and develop new forms of sustainable technology. One of the projects highlighted on the display caught Admiral Keith's attention. That's the Kepler System Restoration Project. The worlds that were completely stripped 6 months ago are showing vegetation patterns. Correct, Vasquez confirmed. The former Devourers have developed biological templates that can rebuild entire ecosystems from trace genetic material. What took evolution millions of years to create, they can restore in months. They're essentially paying reparations by undoing the damage their consumption caused. But it was the cultural implications that proved most profound. Former Devourer artists, beings who had never conceived of creation for its own sake, were producing works that challenged every species' understanding of aesthetic possibility. Their compositions incorporated biological growth patterns as musical instruments, created sculptures that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, and developed poetry that was simultaneously spoken, grown, and mathematically proven. They're not just creating art, observed the cultural analyst who had witnessed the original battle. They're inventing entirely new categories of artistic expression. Beauty that exists as a living process rather than a static object. The former Devourer representative shimmered again, patterns of light dancing across its transformed surface. We spent eons perfecting consumption as an art form. Now we're learning to perfect creation with the same intensity. Every world we restore, every ecosystem we regenerate, every new form of beauty we discover, it feeds us in ways that devouring never could. Admiral Chen brought the discussion back to practical matters. The technological advancement rate across the galaxy has increased by orders of magnitude since the integration began. When you combine human engineering innovation with former Devourer biological mastery and the traditional strengths of all our member species, you create collaborative potential that exceeds anything any single civilization could achieve. The holographic displays showed star charts that looked like something from a utopian dream. Trade routes that operated on principles of mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Research stations where beings from dozens of species worked together on projects that advanced everyone's understanding. Defense networks that existed not to repel invaders but to identify and resolve conflicts before they required military intervention. But perhaps most importantly, Vasquez concluded, we've established a precedent for how advanced civilizations should respond to existential threats. Not with superior firepower, but with superior ideas. Not by destroying what we fear, but by understanding it well enough to transform it into something we can cooperate with. Councillor Thex spoke for the entire assembly when she said, Ambassador, 6 months ago we were facing extinction. Today we're contemplating a form of galactic civilization that none of us had imagined possible. How do we even begin to process such a transformation? One day at a time, Vasquez replied with a smile that encompassed both infinite patience and absolute confidence. We've learned that the universe is far more malleable than most species assume. Reality isn't fixed, it's collaborative. Every conscious being that exists contributes to defining what's possible. She gestured toward the former Devourer delegation, whose bioforms were now pulsing with patterns that any observer could recognize as expressions of joy. They learned to transform consumption into creation. We learned to transform warfare into philosophy. Together, we're learning to transform the galaxy into something that works better for everyone. And somewhere in the space between stars, new songs were being written by beings who had learned that the universe was large enough for everyone to flourish. The galaxy had requested aid and received transformation. The Devourers had demanded consumption and been offered creation. Humanity had been asked for help and had redefined what helping could mean. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't defeating an enemy. It was discovering that enemies were just friends who hadn't learned how to cooperate yet. And the universe itself seemed to approve.